runs in for the biggest touchdown in Nebraska history. It's Jerry Taggy calling signals after a 67-yard march. And on the quarterback keeper, he dives for the goal line, making sure his plunge is across the goal line.
Man, woman, and child is gone. Johnny the Jet Rogers just tore them loose from their shoes.
The snap to Tommy and the give on the trap play, and it's Schlesinger inside the 5. And there for the touchdown. He's got the touchdown. It is history, 13-0, and bring that trophy back to Lincoln. And an option to the right. Tommy on the keep, turns the corner, 25-30. Eludes a tackler, 35. Tommy Frazier, 37, 38, 39, 40, 45, 50, 45, 40, 35, 30. He's gonna go. Holy cow. Touchdown, Tommy Frazier.
The Huskers finish a perfect 13-0. And the word we get, a huge smile on the face of Tom Osborne down there on the field.
In the last 30 years, the Nebraska Cornhuskers have won 5 national championships, more than any football program in the country, more than Miami, Oklahoma, Notre Dame, or Florida State. But winning in Nebraska isn't a recent phenomenon. It began early in the 20th century. Bummy Booth won 25 straight games from 1901 to 1904. Jumbo Steam won 34 straight, including 3 undefeated seasons. From 1921 to 1924, Fred Dawson's Cornhuskers beat Knute Rockne's legendary 4 Horsemen in 2 out of 3 contests. From the beginning, many have wondered how a state that is so isolated and sparsely populated could have such remarkable success for over a century. Some feel the answer is in the spirit of Nebraska's game.
It just matters. It's just really important to people in this state. And as a result, I think the program has reflected that. I think the values that are important to people in this state, hard work and being able to deal with adversity and all the things that go along with being in a farming state are reflected in football.
You know, a lot of sports writers over the years have made a lot of fun of Nebraska. They talk, you know, God gave places mountains and God gave places oceans. He gave Nebraska football.
Hi, I'm Trev Alberts, and I'm from Iowa. So what do I know about Nebraska football? I mean, ever since I was a little kid growing up in Iowa, I dreamed about playing for the Iowa Hawkeyes. I only took a recruiting trip here because it would be a fun, free weekend. But I discovered something special about the University of Nebraska, something that even until this time I've yet to experience the depth of feeling at any other place. I loved playing right here in Memorial Stadium. And I got to sack some of the best quarterbacks in the country. Now, after playing in the National Football League for 3 years and covering college football as a broadcaster, I've seen a lot of football programs. And I promise you, football, as played right here in this place, it's unlike any other in the country. That's what this program's all about. It's a story about how over the last century, a state, its people, and a game have come together with remarkable passion. It's a story about the spirit of Nebraska football.
There is no place like Nebraska, where they're all true blue, and we'll all stick together in all kinds of weather, for dear old Nebraska, you.
In increasing numbers, the sons of the pioneers entered the university. From the farms they came, and from the cities and the towns. But they were boys out of a common mold, endowed with their parents' fierce patience and stubborn confidence and zeal when confronted by handicaps and hazards. The qualities that had won a living in a new land against drought and grasshoppers and searing winds from the south appeared on the football field. Frederick Weir, Omaha World Herald.
If you look at the Nebraska State Journal, the newspaper of the day, the first game that we played in 1890 shared a front page with a story about Indian problems out in the western part of the state. At the same time, the student newspaper, which was the Hesperian, was writing articles about how the University of Nebraska wanted to be a real college. And since the Yales and the Harvards and the Princetons were playing football, Nebraska had to play football to be considered a real college.
In the early 1890s, the University of Nebraska had only 500 students. Many of them were worried that Nebraska would be viewed as a school for hicks and hayseeds. Some students saw football as one way to make sure the university was known for more than just agriculture. And it wasn't just the male students who were championing the new game. Willa Cather, editor of the student newspaper, celebrated football in an 1894 essay.
It's one of the few survivals of the heroic. It arouses only the most simple and normal emotions. Of course it is brutal. So is Homer brutal and Tolstoy. A good football game is an epic. It rouses the oldest part of us.
I think the sort of rough and tumble nature of the sport was attractive to people here because I think people worked hard, spent long hours in the fields, and so football was a game where people played hard, and I think that, you know, there's kind of an affinity for it, that you appreciate that because it takes a tough group of individuals to play football. And I think at that time, around the turn of the century, you know, I think the game was incredibly rough. You look at some of those photographs of those early teams, and I'm not saying that this is the case, but some of those people look like axe murderers. I mean, they were tough individuals, and they didn't play with the equipment that you see today, and you know, people ran the risk of serious injury.
If toughness was a quality respected by Nebraskans, what was the right name for their football team?
Then, of course, there were the bug eaters, and you can see where that would come from if you've ever spent a summer in Nebraska, but I imagine writing on a buckboard, it wouldn't be hard to name the team that, but again, it probably wasn't a very attractive name.
In the early 1890s, drought and depression were so devastating in the state that one Eastern writer reporting on the crisis wrote that Nebraskans were starting to eat bugs simply to survive.
I think the people that were described this way took a certain element of pride in it. That's why I think bug eaters is probably an appropriate description for these early teams, because here are these people that are so hardy, they won't be defeated. You know, if it comes down to eating bugs, you know, they're going to do that because they're survivors. They're going to do whatever it takes to get through.
When the pioneers came to Nebraska, they weren't Nebraskans. They were Germans, Czechs, Poles, Swede, and Irish. From the South, African Americans were coming in search of new opportunity. The immigrants had different customs and even different languages, but despite their passion for self-reliance and independence, they also longed for a common bond. By 1892 at the University of Nebraska, the sons and daughters of the pioneers were beginning to find a sense of unity in an unlikely place with unlikely heroes. In October, when the Bug Eaters won their first major contest against an out-of-state opponent, Illinois, George Flippin from York County was the star. 2 weeks later, Missouri demanded that if Nebraska wanted to play, they had to drop Flippin, an African-American, from the team. The Nebraska players stood behind Flippin, and Missouri was forced to forfeit the game.
Again, I think when you're involved in something as physically demanding as football would have been at that time, I think there's a certain camaraderie that's developed through shared hardship, and I think that you know, if nothing else, they looked at it and said, you know, this guy can take a tremendous amount of abuse and the punishment that's involved in playing this game, and he just keeps coming.
In Flippin's senior year, he was elected captain by his teammates over the objections of Coach Frank Crawford, who said, "It takes a man with brains to be captain." Crawford's comments may have said more about Crawford than Flippin. Flippin was later elected president of the Campus Literary Society. He went on to get a medical degree from the University of Chicago and helped found the first hospital in Stromsburg, Nebraska.
He had to be a remarkable individual to put up with the not only the racist attitudes of some of these opponents, perhaps even a teammate or two. They were no-nonsense type teams. They were hardworking. They had a very clear focus. They persevered, and they were successful. And that's the way it was supposed to be. If you were going to do something, you were going to do it right and do it well, or you weren't going to do it. It wasn't worth your time. And I think that's reflected in the best of the coaches and players over the course of the history of the program.
At the start of the 20th century, the Industrial Revolution was sweeping the country. Americans loved it. There was one sport that perfectly captured the symbolism of industry, progress, and modern American life. It was called football. In Lincoln, Nebraska, the university had grown to over 2,000 students, the 14th largest institution of its kind in the country. But students and fans were searching yet again for the right name for the football team. After using the Bug Eaters, they tried other names, like the Antelopes, the Old Gold Knights, and even the Rattlesnake Boys. But it was a Lincoln sports writer named Cy Sherman who started using the name Cornhuskers. The university officially adopted the title in 1900.
And it seemed to fit Nebraska. After all, if you've been here, there's a whole lot of corn. And folks felt comfortable with it. They felt it wasn't derogatory in any way, felt it was comfortable, felt it kind of captured what Nebraska was all about.
Another appeal of the name Cornhuskers was its rugged sound. Early Nebraskans were steeped in the powerful work ethic necessary to survive on the plains. They were suspicious of anything that seemed like play. But football was different. It looked like work, sounded like work, and when sweat and soil mingled on the field, it even smelled like work. What had been a student sport in the 1890s, by the turn of the century was embraced by Nebraskans across the state with an uncommon passion.
First, Nebraska the state stirred. Then Nebraska bedazzled blinked. And then Nebraska uttered a mighty cry of loyalty and pride and demanded the team for its own. Frederick Weir, Omaha World Herald.
If Nebraska's ethnically diverse mix of farmers and ranchers were still looking for something to give them a sense of common identity, more than a few felt they had found it in football. Nebraska's famous populist William Jennings Bryan said before a big game in 1900, "Nothing but football is in order this day. You, Nebraska, can conquer." And conquer Nebraska did. In 1902 and 1903, the Cornhuskers had undefeated seasons. The university showed its appreciation by paying Coach Bummy Booth more than any professor on campus, almost $2,000. Football was so popular in Nebraska that in 1902, more than 3,000 fans boarded trains for the Minnesota game. The cost was $3 per person. After the team returned from a 6-0 victory over Minnesota, fans marched with the team through the center of town in a spontaneous parade. Bummy Booth's Cornhuskers were known both for their brains and brawn. But of the two, Booth made sure that brawn came first.
Right around the turn of the century, and I'd say 1903, 04, 05, somewhere in there, Earl Eager was one of the players on the team, and he was a small player. His nickname was Dog. And the rules allowed this then. Nebraska would get close to the goal line, and what they'd do is they'd pick up Dog and try to throw him into the end zone. I have this vision of them picking him up and just tossing him in the end zone. And again, another indication of how rough that game must have been. I mean, that's not something that you would want to do with your body, particularly since you're not wearing a helmet and you don't have pads on or whatever, and you're being tossed into the end zone.
In 1911, Ewald Jumbo Steen became coach. His teams quickly began to dominate, despite averaging less than 160 pounds per man.
Jumbo Steen was, by all accounts, a great football coach. And Nebraskans, I think, even of today, would like him because Jumbo Steen won the game on the ground. He believed that the way to do it was simply be bigger and stronger than your opponent and just run right over him. In fact, sports writers love to describe the team as the Steamrollers.
Jumbo Steen was a fierce competitor. In his first game as a coach, the Cornhuskers devastated Kearney State 117-0. In 1913 and 1914, the Steamrollers went undefeated, beating Kansas, Iowa State, and regional powerhouse the Minnesota Gophers. By 1915, Nebraska was dominating the Missouri Valley Conference. But what Nebraskans longed for was national recognition.
I think we were looking for a validation of our position as a state. And if you look at the early history, what really rings bells for Nebraskans in football is when we can beat Eastern powerhouse schools. And so I think Nebraskans have always felt somehow slighted by the Eastern football establishment. And by winning, we validate ourselves and we show those guys. I think that's important to a Nebraskan.
Because of the long distances, it was almost impossible for Nebraska to play games with the Ivy League teams. But there was a national power that was only a day away by train, the University of Notre Dame.
Notre Dame had already established itself as a power in collegiate football, so that anyone who could beat Notre Dame obviously had to be of that same caliber. So Nebraska was more than willing to take Notre Dame on.
In 1915, Nebraska's home games were drawing as many as 8,000 people, almost 5 times as many fans as Notre Dame was drawing in Indiana. Since the school split the gate money, Notre Dame was more than happy to travel to Lincoln to play the Cornhuskers. Leading the Cornhuskers in 1915 was a farm boy from Blue Springs, Nebraska, Guy Chamberlain. At 6'1" and 190 pounds, Chamberlain reportedly could run 100 yards in 10 seconds flat. Scouting the game for the Fighting Irish was a coaching assistant who had just graduated from Notre Dame as a star player the year before. His name was Knute Rockne. Rockne's job was to figure out how to stop Nebraska's Guy Chamberlain.
And Rockne scouted Nebraska in preparation for the Notre Dame game, and he came up with the idea that when Guy Chamberlain would lick his fingers before the ball was snapped, he was going to pass.
In fact, I saw reports of the scouting report, Knute Rockne's, that said Guy Chamberlain never cut back across the grain, so you just pursue him, tackle him, and we're in good shape.
Based on this scouting report, Notre Dame prepared for Nebraska, specifically for Guy Chamberlain, and then when the game was played, Chamberlain crossed him up, and he'd cut back sometimes, and he wouldn't necessarily throw the ball when he'd lick his fingers.
Guy Chamberlain did cut back across the grain. Guy Chamberlain did put on some moves, and he ran Notre Dame into submission in that game.
Nebraska beat Notre Dame 20-19. The next day, Nebraska finally had a taste of national recognition. Sports pages across the country celebrated Nebraska's victory.
I think really, and most observers in Nebraska football history see over Notre Dame in 1915 as this is it. We come of age with that victory. And I think the New York Times had 18-point headlines or something attesting to that fact, saying, you know, the Nebraska now enters the world of big-time football.
Despite the lingering bitterness of the hand-to-hand combat in the trenches of France, America emerged from World War I with a new sense of itself as a world power. Across the country, people were hedonistically roaring into the 20s with a newfound sense of strength and freedom.
The whole country was booming after World War I. The enthusiasm for the good times. The war was over. People were ready to celebrate, to party. And Americans did in the 1920s.
In 1923, Nebraskans decided to build a new stadium to showcase its football team that was building a national reputation. They would call it Memorial Stadium, in honor of those who gave their lives in World War I. It cost almost $500,000, a fortune at the time. And money came not primarily from the legislature, but mostly from avid Nebraska fans.
I mean, the construction of the stadium to me is amazing. Ground was broken in April, and a 20-some thousand seat stadium was opened in October. You know, it would take longer today just to get the permits to build the stadium than to actually construct it. And all of by all the newspaper accounts and so on, it was a magnificent stadium for its time.
At the opening ceremony, the speeches were as hot and high-flying as the spirit of the times.
And one of the speakers in this situation stood up and he challenged the world in this speech. You know, come east, come west, come north, come south, come greatest sprinters of speed.
Come sprinters of speed, come champions crowned with your unbroken record of victory on every field of honor, and Nebraska will meet you on equal terms in the arena.
Well, I think that this does a couple things. I mean, one is, I say, an example of the kind of sports hyperbole, but also it says Nebraska's for real. We're here. We're as good as anyone anywhere in the world. Come here if you don't believe it, and we'll show you. So again, there was that elevation of the Nebraska spirit. We are to be taken seriously. We are to be respected.
The big game in the first year of the new stadium was against perennial rival Notre Dame. Although it would be a year before sports writer Grantland Rice would give them their classic nickname, the Notre Dame backfield featured the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. Describing the players, Grantland Rice wrote,
"Outlined against the blue October sky, the Four Horsemen rode again. In Germanic lore, they're known as famine, pestilence, destruction, and death. These are only aliases. Their real names are Studrider, Miller, Crowley, and Layden."
Notre Dame came in. Notre Dame was heavily favored. Coach at the time was Fred Dawson. Players that I interviewed from the 1923 team talk about what a motivator Fred Dawson was. The kind of pregame speeches he could give to get the players fired up. Said Hartman, who was a halfback on the 1923 team, told me they almost ran through the door on the way out to the field. They were so pumped up.
The game set new records for attendance. Over 20,000 fans packed the new stadium. But despite all the hype about Notre Dame, it was the Cornhuskers who rode off into the sunset of victory. They beat Notre Dame 14-7.
I think that's the only game that Notre Dame lost in 1923. And again, that gave your program or your team credibility.
But again, it's another decade. And so that 1915 victory over Notre Dame was important, but then this becomes important too because it's a revalidation of that same kind of eligibility for membership in the football elite. And I think that's important to Nebraskans. A new field, a new stadium, and we're still as good as we ever were, if not better.
The star of the game was a modest athlete named Ed Weir from Superior, Nebraska.
Knute Rockne went to the Nebraska locker room after the game and wanted to shake hands with Ed Weir because Ed Weir had had a tremendous game, and Knute Rockne described him as the greatest tackle he'd ever seen.
Ed Weir was one of these guys that, again, by all accounts, just loved to play football and was almost John Wayne-like in his humility. Ed Weir was asked, how did he have such great success against Red Grange? And he said, I just saw which way he was running, and I ran after him and tackled him. Again, that kind of humility, or matter-of-factness more so than humility, that's what I'm supposed to do. I'm supposed to tackle people. Or another quote from him was something to the effect that, he'd get into the backfield and he'd tackle everybody he saw until he tackled the guy with the ball. Again, real simple football.
The rivalry between Notre Dame and Nebraska had become one of the most intense in the country. After 9 straight games, the series was dead even, with 4 wins apiece and 1 tie. But the battle wasn't always fought on the field. After the 1923 game, Notre Dame officials complained about many of Nebraska's fans, calling them an anti-Catholic mob. Even Rockne complained of the growing Ku Klux Klan influence in the state. But Rockne wanted the series to continue, partially because Nebraska's gate money was now over $30,000. He wrote a letter apologizing for the negative comments, saying that Nebraska's students and faculty had been very courteous. He added that Notre Dame was only offended by
remarks and actions made by outside hoodlums and small-town sports who happen to attend the game.
But by 1924, the rivalry on and off the field deepened. Nebraska lost to Notre Dame in South Bend 34-7. After the game, Rockne said,
Nebraska, as usual, was the dirtiest team we played. And after the game, a few of their players even called me a few choice epithets.
Notre Dame went on to an undefeated season and was touted by the media as the 1924 national champions. In 1925, Notre Dame came to Nebraska hoping to win back-to-back national championships. Nebraska had lost 2 games and was looking for a major upset to make their season. The Nebraska media intensified the rivalry, calling Notre Dame the horrible Hibernians and roughneck Irish. A record 43,000 fans overflowed Memorial Stadium. Once the game began, the student booster section chanted, "Fish eaters" and "Mackerel snappers go home," and even some profanities that the yellow journalism papers couldn't print. Nebraska dominated the game, winning 17-0. After the game, the students and fans celebrated almost non-stop for 2 days in what the local newspaper described as a riot. Weeks later, Notre Dame decided to cancel future games with Nebraska. Rockne, ever mindful of Nebraska's ticket sales that had ballooned to over $80,000 per game, argued to continue the series, but was overruled by Notre Dame's Catholic administration.
I can't imagine, given the times, the treatment must have been really severe for Notre Dame to make that decision, unless they looked at it and said, well, you know, we haven't beaten Nebraska. We've lost to Nebraska 3 of the last 4 years, so maybe we better move on. I don't think that was really it. I think that it had to do with the anti-Catholic sentiment was a big factor in the decision to discontinue the series. There are probably skeletons that would be left in the closet. You know, it wasn't all just fun and games and a really positive experience from the beginning. Football was not what I would call a refined game during this time, and it didn't always elicit the most noble of human emotions.
Nebraska fans' behavior on and off the field was frequently rough. They were particularly hard on coaches. From 1921 to 1924, Fred Dawson won 75% of his games. His contract wasn't renewed because it was felt he wasn't winning enough. From 1925 to 1928, Ernest Berg won 74%, but fans criticized him for not using enough strategy and deception. He resigned.
You know, there were high fan expectations even back in the 1920s. What's a good enough season? And Nebraska went out and spent, again for the times, big money to hire big-name coaches.
Ironically, one of the big-name coaches they were looking at was Knute Rockne. More than a few Nebraskans felt that winning was important enough to offer the arch-rival coach the job. Rockne turned Nebraska down, but recommended Dana Xenophon Bible, a popular coach from Texas A&M.
You know, by the late 1920s, we had hired DX Bible. We were willing to pay Bible, again, a lot of money, $7,500 to coach the football team, because we wanted him to bring us to that next level of recognition and success.
The high-flying times of the Roaring '20s crashed with the stock market in 1929. In the 1930s, the Great Plains were hit even harder by a devastating drought. Many people were forced to leave their farms and even leave Nebraska. As he was growing up, future Cornhusker All-American Forrest Bem picked up a part-time job as a lineman for the phone company and often visited remote farmhouses.
And I'd walk into the farmyard, all the equipment was gone, had been sold for scrap. There'd be dust piled up against the side of the house. And in the corners of the field that you'd see, tumbleweed would get in there, and then dust would pile on top of it, and then they'd knock the fences over because of the weight of the wind. And you'd go up and knock on the door and think nobody's there, and the door would open, and a gaunt person would face you, and you look behind them in this room, and there'd be 2 or 3 people sitting there, just sitting there. They're starving to death.
You know, I can remember some of the kids just coming in, and they had a pair of jeans and a blue denim shirt, and that was it for the year. That's what they wore all the way through. I would say, though, one thing about being born and raised on a farm. We always had plenty to eat because we butchered the beef, butchered hogs, we had chickens and so on. And I had the old .22 rifle, and many times my mom would say, Al, go get us a couple rabbits, and I'd go down the canyons and shoot a couple rabbits, and that's what we'd have.
During the hard times, football took on a special meaning in Nebraska. The people of the state couldn't control the weather, the government, or the economy. When they needed it most, Nebraskans searched for something over which they could have some control.
I think it was important that the football team was as successful as it was in the 30s. It was important to Nebraskans. It offered proof that some things, you know, the things were going to get better, that you could count on some constants in life. I think what it does is it provides a link to a better past and the promise of a better future.
Nebraskans needed heroes, individuals who could strive against adversity and prevail. One of the favorites of the early 30s was Lloyd Cardwell.
He was a big man for a running back. He was around 190, 200 pounds. And the sports editor at the Omaha World Herald, Frederick Weir, kind of described him as a powerful runner, like a horse across the plains, and he had the nickname the Wild Horse.
Another hero was All-American George Sauer from Lincoln, Nebraska. Number 25 was idolized by young kids.
They would find an old sweater. Then they would have their mother cut out the numbers. Like George Sauer, his number was 25. Everybody wanted to be George Sauer, so the mother would stitch on the number. Everybody felt that they selected the right number with number 25.
But Nebraskans embraced players of every rank, from first string to practice squad.
A lot of players told me about hitchhiking around the state to get home, whether it was back to Seward or Grand Island or what have you. And they said all you had to do is wear your letter sweater, and the first car would stop for you.
A lot of times, you know, we'd have a game and win it, and on Monday or Tuesday I'd get a box in the mail. And it was Mrs. Sapluski from Schuyler sending me a box of kolaches.
By 1936, the Cornhuskers and coach D.X. Bible had won 6 Big Six conference championships in 8 years. At the end of the year, Nebraska was ranked 9th in the country in the very first Associated Press poll. Senior running back Sam Francis was not only a consensus All-American, but was good enough to be voted runner-up in the very first Heisman Trophy race. Despite being the 3rd highest paid coach in the country at $10,000 a year, D.X. Bible decided to return to his home state of Texas, where the university offered him an incredible $15,000 a year. Bible recommended as his successor a military man who would take the Cornhuskers to heights they had never seen before. His name was Major Lawrence McChaney Jones, better known as Biff.
Biff was really a colonel in the Army, and he was still a colonel in the Army. Very dignified, very strong, friendly, but you knew he was boss. He was like a firm father.
If there was a knock on Biff, it was that he was too regimented. If Biff prepared a certain way for a game, the team played that way on Saturday, whatever the game plan was, and don't let God or nature or anybody else interfere. So rain or snow weren't going to change the game plan.
And when practice was over, practice was over. Biff was very, very military, disciplined, and I would say a great leader, really. And, you know, we all admired him for it. Tough? Yes. That's the way it should be.
Biff Jones' first game was against reigning national champions Minnesota. Biff's predecessor, DX Bible, for all his successes, never was able to beat the Golden Gophers.
What did he do? He beat Minnesota, so Biff was in, and this town went berserk. Folks who were staying at the hotels were slashing the feather pillows and dumping the feathers out on the street, dumping water, but they were just having a great time.
Biff Jones had won a special place in the hearts of Cornhusker fans right from the beginning. He was the personification of many of the values that Nebraskans treasured most. He was ethical, hardworking, and well-disciplined. In football, he liked to win in the classic straightforward Nebraska way, with a strong running game. But like many Nebraska coaches before him, he felt a powerful need to win. He was willing to use deception and even skirt the rules of the game to gain an advantage. In one cold game against Iowa, when the players were having a hard time holding onto the ball, he had them wear tacks under their gloves.
Niall Kinnick, who was the star of the University of Iowa team, faded back to throw a pass, and Marion put his hand up to block it, and the ball stuck to his hand. And he said Niall Kinnick just stared at his hand. He couldn't understand, because nobody on the opposing team knew that the Nebraskans had tacks on their hands. But again, different times, you only used one ball per game. And so by the end of the game, the ball was all torn up from these tacks, and nobody could figure out why. The officials couldn't figure out why. The Iowa players couldn't figure out why. Now, it wasn't illegal. I mean, but it was, you know, every coach always looks for an edge, and Nebraska had it in that game.
Nebraska beat Iowa 28-0 and finished the season 11th in the country. But the Cornhuskers' fortunes would change in 1938 when they started the season with a loss to their old nemesis, Minnesota.
The Gophers are rolling, and 3 minutes after the first kickoff, Moore skirts Nebraska's left end for a touchdown, and the crowd goes wild.
The Cornhuskers played 6 games before they won. Many wondered why Coach Biff Jones wasn't recruiting better. Some speculated that Jones was too ethical to get the best. Unlike many schools, Nebraska didn't offer scholarships. And unlike some schools, Nebraska boosters weren't paying players on the side.
Player after player from the 20s and 30s told me about playing schools where, you know, they'd get together with the opposing players after the game and they'd tell them about all of the spending money they got or the pseudo scholarships they got or what have you. Nebraska boys didn't do that. In fact, some Nebraska players told me they used to lie about it after a while. They got so embarrassed the fact that they weren't getting paid that they'd be talking to players from another school. Oh yeah, we get that too. Just so they wouldn't look like some hick from the sticks.
But there was another unmentioned problem in recruiting. Like almost every other school in the country, Nebraska wasn't recruiting African-American athletes.
We had blacks in our high schools. I played with them there. Didn't have blacks on the football team. And it was just and I didn't realize until later that the blacks couldn't get their hair cut in town. I mean, disgrace, absolute disgrace. And why didn't I know that? You know, is the real question. Why, as a young man and growing up, why didn't I know that? I didn't know that.
It had been almost 25 years since a black had played for the Cornhuskers. After George Flippin in the 1890s, several black football players distinguished themselves playing for Nebraska, including Bill Johnson and Robert Taylor in 1905. But by 1938, no blacks had played for Nebraska since Clinton Ross in 1913.
We did not have blacks on our team because we played Missouri and Oklahoma, and they wouldn't play us if we had blacks on the team. Period. And that's just part of this whole disgrace of prejudice. What an embarrassment. What an embarrassment.
In 1938, Nebraska was still deep in the Great Depression. The athletic department's budget was so small, they had a hard time outfitting new players.
So I went down to Floyd Borthoff, who was the equipment manager, and he gave me a shirt that was, jersey was all beat up, and some shoulder pads that were worse, and hip pads that looked like they'd gone many, many years, and some pants. And then he said, "What size shoes do you wear?" I said, 15. He said, "You can't come out." I said, "Why not?" He said, "We can't afford to buy you shoes." This is, again, pretty tough days. And I said, "Well, how if I buy my own shoes?" Back he goes to Lewandowski, comes back and says, "Yeah, you buy your own shoes, you can come out."
But despite the tight budgets of the Depression, when the team rode the trains to away games, they had their own dining car.
And I've seen menus from those games, and one of the interesting things, we would travel down to Lawrence to play the University of Kansas, and it was a day trip. I mean, the train would leave in the morning and it would come back after the game. And there would be these menus of roast turkey dinner and dressing and so on at 11 o'clock in the morning, and the game was 1:30 in the afternoon. And I said to him, "You ate roast turkey and dressing and mashed potatoes and cranberry sauce and so on, and then played a game 2 hours later?" And they'd look at you and they'd say, "I wasn't going to pass up a meal. You know, this was the best meal I had all week."
In the 30s, train travel was time-consuming, but it had positive effects on team spirit.
We traveled by train, and it's unbelievable today that that's how we traveled. And for many of us, we had never been on a train. But everywhere we went, the towns we went through, the word was out, and there'd be people at the crossing waving and cheering us on. The players today just don't realize what they're missing by going by air and not experiencing and getting to know your teammates. We really were able to become great friends and have a bond.
Nebraska needed team spirit. Since they didn't recruit outside the state, and since they didn't offer scholarships, they needed to get the most out of whatever players they had. By the late 30s, they were finding inspiration in an unexpected place.
Come a-running, boys, don't you hear that noise?
Like the thunder in the sky, as it rolls along with a good old song for the sons of Nebraska.
The way I was introduced to the song was players telling me that Link Lyman, who was one of the coaches, assistant coaches, would always lead the singing of that song. Link would begin the singing of the song, and Link was a former Nebraska player who weighed 270-some pounds, which was just huge in the 1920s and 30s, and he played for the Chicago Bears.
And here we are in Minnesota, and old Link Lyman starts that, and you know what went through my mind? What in the world's going on? And then I looked around and see the color going out of their faces, you know, setting that tone for the singing of that song and what it meant. And suddenly I felt, oh, I'm missing out on something. I didn't even know the words, you know. But boy, I sure learned them before the next game.
Now it's coming near with a rousing cheer that will sweep all foes away. So
And when we sang that, it was almost, I would say, comparable to those things that happen when a man in the military is going into battle, knowing that his life is at stake and that he has to draw together with all of his comrades to get the desired result.
Though we've gone through many a battle, our colors still are seen.
It was a tremendous emotional lift, and it brings tears to your eyes.
So in contest and in victory, we will wave them for the team, and we'll always stir a corn husker, the old scarlet and the cream. I haven't sung that for a while.
In 1939, Nebraska finished the season ranked 18th in the country. At the start of the 1940 season, almost all of the starting players were returning. They had been through a lot together and had formed a special bond.
Warren was older, he was like 4 years older than I was or so on, but class guy, good athlete, good citizen. Sometimes I called him Dad.
Florrie Bem was just a giant among the short trees, so to speak. Tall, imposing person, extremely intelligent. He was the cadet colonel of the military ball, and at 6'4" and 220 pounds, what an imposing figure he was in that military uniform. Everybody loved him.
So I don't know what else I could say about Schwarzkopf, except he was a terrific guy and a good man to be around and a good guy to be in a fight with. If I had to go up a hill to a machine gun nest, I'd be glad to have Schwarzkopf with me.
You could take that group like this, and we'll play the Green Bay Packers and not back off. That's kind of the attitude that that group had, and we were close-knit, very much together.
You and I, first and I, and Nebraska. Oh, my.
After an initial loss to their old rival Minnesota, the Cornhuskers won the rest of their games, finishing the 1940 season with 8 wins and 1 loss. Then something unprecedented happened. In early December, Nebraska was invited to its first bowl game, the Rose Bowl. The Cornhuskers were headed to Pasadena, California to play the Stanford Indians on New Year's Day. Tickets sold out in 3 days. More than 5,000 fans were headed to California. The team of 40 players and 4 coaches boarded a special train headed west. 3 Pullmans, a club car, and a private diner. The Union Pacific and Santa Fe put on special packages for fans to travel with the team. The complete cost for train, hotel, and tickets to the game was $58.95.
We had trouble getting on the train. Huge numbers. They estimated there's 15,000 of them down at the railroad station, down at the Burlington in the downtown area. And everywhere we went, there were people. It was just a great, great experience.
Lyle Brimser gave nightly radio reports of what was happening. The newspapers sent reporters along with the team and so on. So, I mean, as much as you would have in 1940, January 41, there was saturation coverage.
And here he is, the man who spells touchdown with a capital T.
Sports writers focused much of their pregame analysis on Stanford's new T formation, as developed by Coach Clark Shaughnessy.
Any doubt as to why it's called the T?
The formation allowed for backfield motion and deception of a kind the Cornhuskers had never seen before.
The man in motion, whoa. The quick dives, the straight-ahead quick plays, you know, boy, I've never seen anything like that.
On January 1st, 1941, while fans were watching the Cornhusker Marching Band in its first bowl game parade, the team's intensity was building as they boarded buses to the game.
Link Lyman's face is as red as a beet, you know, because he's all excited, and I'm sure that old Biff cigarette was going like that, but we got on that bus, and it was dead silence. Dead silence. Nobody talked. We thought football.
Come a-running, boys, don't you hear that noise, like the thunder in the sky?
Before the team took the field, Biff Jones asked assistant coach Link Lyman to lead the team in song.
But old Link Lyman used to start us on that song, you know, a big old deep voice, come a-running, boys, don't you hear that noise? Away we'd go and sing that song, and by the time we got out of there, we all were sweating.
Our colors still are seen.
But old George Abel would get so wound up when we sang that Come a-Runnin' Boys that he'd run out of the dining hall and toss his cookies. He couldn't even hold down the oranges and dry toast and tea because he was so hyped up.
And the cream.
As the team took the field, they saw something they had never seen before, a crowd of 92,000 fans. To this day, it is still the largest crowd to ever watch a Cornhusker football game. On the opening kickoff, Nebraska fullback Vike Francis returned the ball for 28 yards.
I thought we were going to win the game, no question about it. And we marched right down the field, we moved the ball well, and I thought we handled the thing quite well.
We thought this is going to be great because we moved down that field just like we did all year long. You know, and it looked like, boy, this is going to be our day.
In 7 straight plays, Nebraska moved the ball to the Stanford 1-yard line. Fullback Vike Francis tried to get Coach Biff Jones' attention.
Vike got a little bit gassed down there about the 10-yard line, and he gave the signal to come out, and Biff says, stay in there. And then he scored the touchdown. Scored the touchdown, he says, we're in this thing now.
Stanford fought back and tied the game 7-7. Al Zickman remembers what happened next.
Willard Bunker was tight end, and I was a wingback, and I said, Willard, switch with me. I can run the deep route, I can beat these guys. And so we switched routes. Willard ran the flat route, and I ran the deep route. And Hermie laid that baby out there, and it was just a little bit behind, and I jumped and caught it back over my shoulder like that and got into the end zone for a touchdown.
Stanford came back yet again to score on a pass from All-American Frankie Albert. On the next kickoff return, something happened that would change the direction of the game. Al Zickman hurt his leg snap when he was tackled. He limped to the sidelines to talk to Coach Biff Jones.
Biff said to me, well, Zicker, let's see you run. So I ran down the sidelines, gee, felt good. But when I turned to come back, no way. Because it was a jagged break and the edge of the bone was caught like that. And when I turned, those bone ends kind of grated together. It's not a pleasant feeling, to say the least. So I came back and I said, Coach, I'm sorry. I can run straight ahead, but I can't turn.
With one of Nebraska's fastest players out of the game, Stanford's speed began to take its toll. But late in the game, with Stanford first and goal on the Nebraska 3-yard line, the Cornhuskers mounted a goal line stand. As soon as Nebraska took over the ball on downs, Biff Jones decided to try a quick kick on first down to get the ball out of Nebraska territory. But as fate would have it, the ball wound up in the hands of one of Stanford's fastest players, Pete Kometovic.
Kometovic got that ball, and I could see the wall coming. They're building a wall! And they built the wall and just cut our players down. That was the one that laid the block on the top of the casket.
Stanford won the game 21-13. A few days later, the team train arrived back in Lincoln.
Unbelievable, the huge crowd that was waiting for us to welcome us back. And we pulled into the depot down at Burlington. They were just lined all around, and we thought we won.
And then I can remember as that train pulled into the station, seeing all the people lined up along there, and naturally you're looking out to see if you can see someone you know, and I looked out and found my roommate and some of the kids and gals in our classes and everything, and they're waving their arms off at you and so on. It made you kind of forget maybe that you should have won the game, but you kind of felt like the hero returning home.
And so Nebraskans felt that their boys, and I think 39 out of the 40 players were Nebraskans on the team, their boys had done the state proud. They'd gone out to the West Coast, comported themselves well, and played a good game. And really, those players were held in high esteem the rest of their lives in Nebraska. And there are Nebraskans who are old enough to listen to the game and still can tell you the starting lineup, can still remember the names of the players. They were the heroes and were treated as such when they came back.
I feel this way about that Rose Bowl team. There were some people who were a little bit different, that's like any human being may be. But boy, you put us together like that. That was one fine group, one tough bunch of football players, one intense group of football players, all with the same aim. Come a-running, boys.
Come a-running, boys, don't you hear that noise? Like the thunder in the sky. How it rolls along in a good old song.
And a terrific program, Husker Century, in the books. Part 1 of Part 3. You saw the to be continued.